Good morning, everyone. We're looking at here is Chapter 17, Lesson 2, and what we're really trying to get at here is this understanding of why people began to protest the Vietnam War. And the issue at heart is a credibility gap, which is this lack of trust or believability. The fact that someone is telling you one thing, but really it's something else. And I'm pretty sure we've all had friends where that's happened, right? Where they've told us one thing, but the truth was something else. In this case, it's LBJ, it's the Johnson administration telling us that the enemy is near defeat, that the Viet Cong are going to give up, with news reports continually contradicting this, showing us that, in fact, the Viet Cong are not ready to give up and that they're not going to quit anytime soon. In fact, when this happens, and as this happens, the credibility gap gets wider and wider and wider, and televised news coverage of Vietnam and the Vietnam War each night, this really makes Americans begin to doubt whether or not what the reports about the war. And as a result, you're going to see more and more different groups decide to protest. You're going to see, for example, college faculty and students get together. They're going to protest against the Vietnam War. They're going to just abandon their classes. They're going to gather together and informally and discuss issues about the Vietnam War. It's called the sit-in, or I'm sorry, it's called the teach-in. And the teach-in is, it's a way of forcing people to confront the issue, to talk about it, so that it's just not something that we just take somebody's word for. In fact, one of these groups that participates in teach-ins, called the Students for a Democratic Society, they organize a march on Washington that draws over 20,000 people, and attending this march on Washington. And if you were going to take all these protests, these teach-ins and all the other kinds of protests out there, and you were going to boil it down, they all focus on two big issues. One of them, number one, is that there was a corrupt dictator in South Vietnam, and that supporting or defending that country is immoral and unjust because this guy's a corrupt dictator, right? Others opposed the draft system. Military recruiters who were drafting people to fight in Vietnam, they were going after working class minorities. They were deliberately targeting Hispanics, African Americans, etc., because they were easy targets, right? The Army can give you a paycheck, give you a place to live, it can give you benefits, access to the GI Bill. I mean, come on, right? It's better than an impoverished inner city. This focus on ethnic minorities led to 1/2 of everyone that was killed, wounded, or missing in Vietnam coming from the working class or being poor. It's a poor man's war. 20% of deaths early on in the war are African American. 1 out of every 5 people that's killed is African American. That's a larger percentage than we actually have in the United States. What we see here is people begin to really kind of protest this idea that you're old enough to fight and die, but you're not even old enough to vote. So you can't even vote out the people that are sending you to die. So these issues with the draft, they do get resolved eventually. For example, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution does give 18-year-olds the right to vote. So if you are old enough to die, you are old enough to vote now. And the draft does become a bit less of an issue in 1969 when the government kind of gives a lottery system where everyone gets a lottery number. And only those people with low lottery numbers are the ones that have to really worry about the draft. So that by war's end, only 12% of deaths were black Americans. So we see that number drop from 20% to 12%. So, this kind of thing really does help. It does work, these protests. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to start supporting the war. These protests, they grow and they grow and they grow and they grow, and eventually, by 1968, it really feels like our nation is kind of divided, that our nation really is split into two camps. The Doves who want to withdraw from Vietnam, get out of the war, and the Hawks who want to keep fighting the communists. So you've got these people in America who we're split. We're split 50-50. It's a pivotal year in Vietnam. It's a year, 1968, where by this time not only are we split 50-50, Hawks and Doves. We just don't know what's going to happen next in America. So for example, For example, President Johnson kept telling us that the Viet Cong and North Vietnam are close to defeat, right? We know the credibility gap is out there, and that the news doesn't show that. Well, one example of this would be right around the new year, right around the end of January, early February in the United States in 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year. It's called Tet. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese armies launched attacks at nearly every American base and on nearly every southern Vietnam city. So we have an enemy that's supposed to be on the brink of defeat mounting a huge, large-scale campaign against us. That doesn't really work. Now, I mean, it was a major political defeat for the United States. Now, we did militarily win the battle. We beat them back. We won we beat the Tet Offensive. But politically, this can't be an army that is near defeat if they're able to attack everywhere at once, right? I mean, that's just not how that works. So what you actually begin to see then is a shift where America's media no longer just reports on the war, creating the credibility gap. Now they're openly criticizing the war. So that credibility gap in the number of people that don't want to have a role in Vietnam will continue to grow. As we begin to realize that this war could drag on for years and years and years and years, maybe another decade, Democrats, Americans, they abandoned President Johnson. They don't want him to run for president again in 1968. We actually see in 1968, President Johnson announced on television that he's not going to run for re-election. So here's President Johnson saying, I'm not going to run. I'm not going to take role. And don't forget, 1968 is a crazy year for lots of reasons, right? We see Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated in 1968, Robert Kennedy assassinated in 1968. It's a crazy, crazy year in American history, and it's really a turning point in the Vietnam War. Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that the credibility gap, the Tet Offensive, all these kinds of things that happened in 1968, the protests and the March on Washington, the people upset over the draft, all of this, that by 1968 with this presidential election, it creates a crazy, crazy election season. Richard Nixon, the Republican, is up against George Wallace, who's a Dixiecrat. And Hubert Humphrey, who's a Democrat, and now Wallace is a segregationist, and he's there to show that we need to go after those people who support civil rights. Nixon is beating everybody, and he has this message that he's going to kind of bring the nation back together. That's his message, that he wants a nation of law and order, and he wants Americans, the silent majority of Americans, who've wanted law and order, to step forward and vote for him and be done with the protesting and be done with the war. And he says we're going to have peace in Vietnam, but we're going to do it honorably. We might not win, but we're not going to lose, right? It's going to be a victory of sorts. We're at peace with honor. We'll leave on our terms. It's a close election by the end. Hubert Humphrey closes that gap, and it's close, 43 to 42, the popular vote, where Nixon wins the popular vote. But he does win by 100 electoral votes, so it's a pretty substantial electoral college victory. But this is going to be a big deal because, it's a shift to Republicans, and it's a shift to looking for a way to have peace in Vietnam. And so we'll see kind of where all this goes.